Thunder cracked across the Kentucky sky like a gunshot. Rain hammered down in sheets so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The road through the Appalachian Mountains had turned into a river water, running fast and dark over asphalt that hadn't been repaved since 1987. 30 headlights cut through the storm. They moved in pairs, slow and careful, engines roaring against the wind. Motorcycles, big ones. Harleys mostly, with a few Indians mixed in. Expensive bikes. The machines men saved years to afford. The bikes that belonged to men who didn't ask permission for much of anything. The column had been riding for 6 hours straight. 6 hours in rain that felt like needles against exposed skin. 6 hours with nowhere to stop, nowhere to get warm, nowhere to even take a breath that didn't taste like wet leather and gasoline. 2 bikes had already gone down on a slick curve 5 miles back. One rider had a broken collarbone. Another had taken a bad spill into a ditch and dislocated his shoulder so badly you could see the joint sitting wrong under his wet jacket. They were still riding, both of them, because there was nowhere else to go. No motel for 40 miles. No gas stations open. Cell phones were useless up here. The signal had died an hour ago, somewhere around the time the storm turned from bad to biblical. Then one of them saw it. A single yellow porch light burning across a field, maybe 200 yards off the main road. Just one light in all that darkness. One small circle of warmth in a world that had gone cold and mean. The lead rider, a man with a beard halfway down his chest and a leather vest soaked clean through, raised his left hand. The signal passed down the column. 30 engines slowed. 30 riders turned off the highway onto a gravel drive that was more mud than gravel at this point. The house sat at the end of that drive like something out of an old photograph. 2 stories white paint peeling in strips, a porch that sagged on the left side, a roof with 3 different colors of shingles where repairs had been done over the years. There was a barn off to the right, leaning slightly, a tool shed with a door that hung crooked, a garden plot turned to mud. A house past its prime, a house where people stayed because they had always been there, not because they had anywhere better to go. The porch light burned yellow and steady. 30 men rode up that gravel drive 2 by 2. They parked in a loose formation around the front yard, engines cutting out one after another, until there was nothing but the sound of rain on metal and leather and the distant rumble of thunder moving east. The bearded man dismounted first. He was tall, maybe 6'4", with shoulders that looked like they'd been built for carrying things. His name was Garrett Blackwood, though most people called him Reaper, and he'd been riding with the Hells Angels for 23 years. Long enough to know when you were in trouble, long enough to know when you were out of options. He looked at the house, looked at that porch light, looked at the front door with its warped bottom edge and the screen door that probably hadn't closed right since 2003. Then he walked up the steps and knocked. Not a polite knock, a hard knock, the kind that says we're here and we need help and we're not leaving. The door shook on its hinges. Inside the house, an old man set down his coffee mug. It was 9:47 on a Tuesday night in October of 2016, and Warren Hartwell had been sitting in his recliner doing a crossword puzzle when the first engine had rumbled up the drive. He was 73 years old. He stood 6'2", though he'd probably been 6'3" before his spine started settling. He had hands that looked like they'd been built in a different era when men worked with their hands and didn't complain about it. He looked at his wife. She was already standing. Evelyn Hartwell was 71 years old and barely 5'4", but she moved like a woman who'd spent 40 years teaching 5th graders and knew exactly how to handle a room full of chaos. She had gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt and house slippers that had seen better days. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look surprised. She just looked at the door like it was any other door on any other night. Warren started to stand, started to reach for the shotgun he kept in the coat closet, not because he was paranoid, but because this was rural Kentucky, and sometimes you needed a shotgun. Evelyn put her hand on his shoulder. She walked to the door. She didn't hesitate, didn't look through the peephole, didn't ask who it was. She just turned the knob and pulled the door open wide. 30 soaked, leather-clad bikers stood in front of her, most of them armed, all of them strangers. Rain dripped off their beards, their jackets, their boots. Some of them were bleeding, some of them were limping. All of them looked like they'd been through something that had stripped them down to bare survival. Evelyn looked at the man closest to her, the tall one with the beard, the one who'd knocked. She looked him right in the eyes, not at his vest with its patches, not at the knife on his belt, or the outline of what might have been a gun under his jacket, just at his face. And she said the words that decided everything. Get inside before you all catch pneumonia. That was it. That was the whole conversation. Warren came up behind her. He saw the bikers. He saw the storm. He saw men who looked like they'd been riding through hell and he had just barely made it out the other side. He took it all in for about 3 seconds. Then he reached past his wife and pushed the screen door wider. He waved them in with one big arm, the gesture a man uses when he's moving cattle into a barn or telling a dog to come on inside. Boots off in the mudroom, he said. His voice was deep and rough from 50 years of not talking more than necessary. Don't worry about the floors. 30 men walked into that little farmhouse. They moved slowly, carefully, like men who couldn't quite believe what was happening. They stepped through the door one at a time. 30 pairs of boots came off in the mudroom, which was really just a small space between the front door and the living room with a bench and some hooks and a floor that had been scuffed by decades of farm boots and work shoes. 30 leather jackets, soaked and dripping, got hung up on every available surface. Hooks, doorknobs, the back of chairs, the stair railing. Water pooled on the floor. The house smelled like wet leather and rain and motor oil and something else, something harder to name. The smell of men who'd been pushing their limits. The men were big. Most of them were quiet. A few of them were limping badly. One was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, a clean slice that had probably come from a tree branch whipping across his face during the ride. Another had a shoulder hanging wrong, the joint clearly dislocated, maybe broken. His face was pale, but he wasn't making a sound. Evelyn saw all of that in one sweep of her eyes. She had been a teacher for 40 years. 40 years of watching fifth graders try to hide injuries on the playground, try to pretend they weren't hurt, try to be tougher than they were. She knew what pain looked like when someone was trying to bury it. Warren, she said, get the first aid box from the bathroom, the big one. Already getting it, Warren said. Now here's the thing about Warren and Evelyn Hartwell. They were not naive people. They were not stupid people. They were not people who didn't watch the news or understand that the world could be a dangerous place. Warren was 73 years old. He had done a tour in Vietnam in 1968 as a Marine. He'd been 25 years old when he stepped off a helicopter into a jungle that was trying to kill him. He'd seen things other people only saw in nightmares. He'd carried wounded men through swamps while people shot at him. He'd gone 3 days without sleep and 5 days without a hot meal and 2 weeks without knowing if he was going to make it home. He knew what a dangerous man looked like. He could see it in the way they moved, in the way they held themselves, in the way their eyes tracked movement, even when they were standing still. And he knew that several of these men in his living room were very dangerous men. He let them in anyway. Evelyn was 71. She had taught fifth grade in the next county over for 4 decades. She had raised one son. They had lost that son when he was 26 years old. She did not talk about that anymore. Some wounds don't heal. You just learn to carry them. But she had a particular way of looking at younger men ever since. She looked at them like every one of them was somebody's boy, somebody's son who'd been small once, who'd scraped his knees and cried and needed his mother. She looked at these 30 men exactly that way. The story behind those 30 men was simple enough. They were a chapter of Hell's Angels riding south through the mountains to attend a memorial for a brother who had died the week before. Motorcycle accident down in Tennessee. He'd been riding for 30 years, and then one morning a truck didn't see him, and that was the end of it. They'd planned a hard ride, 2 days, sleep in the saddle if they had to. They hadn't planned for the storm. The storm came down on them like a hammer. The road they were on washed out. 2 of their bikes went down on that slick curve. One man broke his collarbone. The impact had been so hard, they all heard the crack over the sound of engines and thunder. Another took a bad spill into a ditch, his bike sliding out from under him, and his body ragdolling across gravel and mud until he hit a drainage culvert. They had been riding for 6 hours in that downpour with no place to stop. No motel for 40 miles. No gas stations open. Phones useless. The signal was gone. They saw one porch light burning out across a field. One single yellow porch light through the rain. They turned in. That porch light belonged to Warren and Evelyn. The bearded man, Garrett, stood in the middle of the living room, dripping water onto a rug that had probably been there since 1975. He looked at Evelyn. His voice was deep, tired, hoarse from yelling over engines for hours. "You folks got any towels we can use?" Evelyn looked at him like he'd just asked the world's simplest question. "Linen closet," she said. "Top of the stairs. Take all of them. There are blankets in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the back room. Take those too." Garrett stared at her for a moment. Rain dripped off his beard onto the floor. His boots, even though he'd taken them off, had left muddy prints across the mudroom. "Ma'am," he said, "you don't even know us." "I know you're cold," Evelyn said. "That's enough for me." She turned and walked into the kitchen. Warren pulled the wounded man with the forehead cut into a kitchen chair and started cleaning the wound with peroxide and cotton balls from the first aid kit. The man sat still. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. Just let Warren work. The man with the dislocated shoulder sat down at the table without a word. He was younger, maybe 30, with tattoos running up both arms and a face that looked like it had been in a few fights. His shoulder sat wrong under his wet shirt, the joint clearly out of place. Warren looked at him. The man nodded once. Warren put one hand on his shoulder, one hand on his elbow, and popped it back into place in one practice motion. The sound was audible across the kitchen, a wet pop like a chicken bone breaking. The man let out a long breath through his teeth. He did not cry out, did not curse, did not do anything except close his eyes for 3 seconds and breathe. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Warren. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," Warren said. "My wife's about to feed you." In the kitchen, Evelyn was already pulling the big cast iron pot off the bottom shelf. The one her mother had given her on her wedding day 51 years ago. The one she had cooked in for half a century. It was heavy, seasoned black, older than most of the men standing in her living room. She set it on the stove and turned the burner up high. She opened the freezer, started pulling things out: beef chunks, a bag of carrots, potatoes, an onion. She moved fast and she did not measure anything. This was muscle memory, cooking you did when you'd made the same meal 1,000 times. The pot came to a simmer within 20 minutes. Evelyn had a way with stew that nobody else in the county could match. She just knew. Knew when to add the salt, when to add the pepper, when to let it sit, and when to stir it. Beef chunks, carrots, potatoes, onions. She had grown in the side garden. Tomatoes she had canned in August. Garlic, salt, pepper. A splash of red wine from a bottle Warren kept in the pantry for special occasions. Bay leaf. Thyme. She moved fast and she did not measure anything. While the stew simmered, she pulled out a sack of cornmeal and started making cornbread. 2 pans, then 4 pans, then 6 pans. She kept going. She had 30 men in her house, and they were wet and cold and hungry, and that was all that mattered. Warren started a fire in the wood stove in the living room. A working fire. Oak logs stacked for heat not show. He got the kindling going, and within 10 minutes the warmth was pushing through the house. The bikers stripped off wet jackets and hung them on the staircase railing. Most of them did not talk. They sat on the floor, on the couch and chairs, wherever there was space. They breathed. They looked at each other like men who had just gotten back from somewhere very bad and couldn't quite believe they'd made it. Garrett, the bearded leader, finally took a seat at the kitchen table. He set his big, rough hands flat on the wood. The table was old, scarred with decades of use. You could see knife marks from when someone had used it as a cutting board. Water rings from glasses and coffee mugs. A burn mark from when someone had set down a hot pan without thinking. He looked at Warren, who was now putting iodine on the forehead cut. "Sir," Garrett said, "you should know who you let into your house." Warren glanced at him, didn't stop working, just kept dabbing iodine on the wound, careful and methodical. "I know who's in my house," Warren said. "I'm looking at them. We're Hell's Angels." "Yep." "You see the patch." "I see the patch." "And you let us in." Warren taped a bandage over the cut. He stepped back. He looked at Garrett dead in the eye. Warren had gray eyes that looked like they'd seen things and decided not to talk about them. Son, he said, I was 25 years old in a swamp in Vietnam in 1968. The man who carried me out when I caught shrapnel in both legs was named Dale. Dale rode a Harley back home. Dale wore a vest just like yours. Different patch, but the same kind of brotherhood. Dale died of cancer in 1989. He was the best friend I ever had. Garrett did not say anything for a long second. The only sound was the pot simmering on the stove and the fire crackling in the living room and rain hammering the roof like it was trying to get inside. I don't care what's on your vest, Warren said quietly. I care that you're cold and you're hurt and you're far from home. Now eat my wife's cornbread or she's going to be insulted. Evelyn walked in carrying a basket of warm cornbread cut into thick squares. The smell filled the kitchen. Butter and cornmeal and heat. She set it down in the middle of the table. She did not say a word. She just started ladling stew into bowls. Big heavy bowls you held with both hands. 30 men ate that night. They ate everything Evelyn put in front of them. The first bowls went fast. Hot stew thick with beef and vegetables. Food that fills you up and warms you from the inside. Then she ladled out seconds, then thirds for some of the bigger ones. The cornbread vanished. She made more. Pulled out another pan, mixed another batch, had it in the oven before the last piece of the previous batch was gone. She kept going until every man at her table had pushed his bowl away with a slow groan and rubbed his stomach like he couldn't believe how much he'd eaten. Nobody spoke much during the meal. The only sounds were spoons against bowls and wood crackling in the stove and rain hammering the roof. It was the first hot food most of them had eaten in 2 days. Some of them had been riding since Sunday, and this was Tuesday night, and they'd been living on gas station coffee and whatever they could grab at rest stops. This was real food, home food, food somebody made because they cared whether you lived or died. Garrett looked up halfway through his second bowl. There was a photograph on the mantel in the living room just visible from his seat at the kitchen table. A young man in a Marine dress uniform. White hat, white gloves, smiling. An official military portrait they took right after boot camp. Garrett could see Warren's eyes in that face. The same shape, the same depth. But the cheekbones were Evelyn's. Sharp and high. The smile was hers too. The nameplate at the bottom read Corporal Clayton Hartwell, 1967 to 1993. 26 years old. Too young. Warren noticed Garrett looking. He didn't say anything, just took a slow sip of bourbon. Some wounds you don't talk about, you just carry them. Garrett looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not ask about it. After dinner, Evelyn brought out coffee. Real coffee made strong the way her mother had taught her. Not the weak stuff people made in modern coffee machines. This was coffee you could stand a spoon in. Coffee that tasted like it meant business. She brought out a pound cake she had baked that morning. Dense and buttery and perfect with coffee. Warren pulled an old bottle of bourbon out of the cabinet and set it on the table with no ceremony at all. Help yourselves, he said. Some of the men took coffee, some took bourbon, some took both. Nobody took too much. There was respect in the way they handled themselves. These were not men who came into someone's home and acted like they owned it. These were men who understood hospitality, understood when someone had extended a hand, understood that you didn't abuse that. The bikers slept in shifts that night. The big living room held about 15 of them on the floor with blankets and pillows from every closet in the house. Some of them used couch cushions. Some used their leather jackets rolled up as pillows. They arranged themselves carefully, quietly, like soldiers bivouacking in the field. The back bedroom held 5 more. Evelyn had put fresh sheets on the bed even though it was 11:30 at night and she was exhausted. Because that's what you did. You put fresh sheets on the bed when you had guests. She put the 2 wounded men in the guest room, the one with the broken collarbone and the one who dislocated his shoulder. They needed real beds. They needed to be able to sleep without someone stepping on them. Warren and Evelyn took the small couch in the den. They shared it like teenagers, her head on his shoulder, his hand on hers. The couch was too small for 2 people to sleep comfortably, but they'd been married 51 years and they knew how to fit. Neither of them slept much, but neither of them was afraid. At 4:30 in the morning, Garrett was already up. He'd slept maybe 2 hours, which was about standard for him on the road. He was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, drinking the last of the coffee from the pot Evelyn had made. It was still warm. She'd left it on low heat. Evelyn came in. She was wearing a bathrobe over her nightgown and the same house slippers from earlier. She did not turn the light on. She just refilled his cup from the pot. "Ma'am," Garrett said quietly, "I want you to know something." "You don't owe me an explanation," Evelyn said. "I'm not explaining," he said. "I'm telling." She sat down across from him. The kitchen was dark except for the small light over the stove. Outside, the rain had stopped. The storm had moved on sometime around 3 in the morning. You could hear water dripping from the eaves from the trees from the barn roof. But no more thunder, no more lightning. "You and your husband fed 30 men tonight," Garrett said. "You took us in when we were dead on our feet. You patched us up. You gave us your beds. You didn't ask us a single question. You didn't ask why we were on the road. You didn't ask what we'd done. You didn't ask how dangerous we were." "No," Evelyn said, "I didn't." "Why?" Evelyn thought about that for a long moment. She looked at this big, dangerous man sitting at her kitchen table. This man with the beard and the scars and the vest with patches that said things about brotherhood and loyalty and living outside the lines. "Because somebody's mother is sitting up tonight worrying about every one of you," she finally said. "And I would have wanted somebody to do the same for my boy." Garrett looked down at his coffee. He took a long breath. His hands were wrapped around the mug like he was trying to hold on to its warmth. "Where's your boy now, ma'am?" he asked. Evelyn was quiet. Then she said very softly, "He's been gone 23 years. Garrett nodded slowly. He did not say he was sorry. He did not try to fill the silence with words that wouldn't help. He just looked at her and let what she had said sit in the room between them. He understood loss. He understood wounds that don't heal that you just learn to carry. He'd lost his father. He'd lost brothers. He knew that sometimes the only thing you could do was acknowledge the weight and not pretend it wasn't there. "Drink your coffee," Evelyn said gently. "You've got a long ride." By 6 in the morning, the storm had broken. The sky was washed pale blue, that thin, fragile blue you only get right after a hard rain when everything's been scrubbed clean. The air smelled like wet earth and pine and possibility. The bikers were gathered on the porch and in the front yard putting on jackets that Evelyn had hung overnight by the wood stove. They were still damp, but they were warm. That made all the difference. They walked out to their bikes one by one, 30 men, 30 motorcycles. Some of them ran their hands over their bikes, checking for damage from the ride. A few had scratches. One had a cracked mirror, but they'd all made it. Garrett stood on the porch. He took Warren's hand and shook it. His grip was firm. Warren's grip was firmer. "Sir," Garrett said. "Ma'am, thank you." "You're welcome," Warren said. "Ride safe." 30 engines started up. The sound rolled across the field like distant thunder. But it wasn't angry thunder. It was purposeful. The sound of men who'd found shelter and were now heading back out into the world. 30 taillights moved down the gravel drive. 2 by 2, gently, no roaring, no showing off, just gone. Warren and Evelyn stood on the porch in the cool morning air. The sun was coming up over the tree line, painting everything gold and pink and orange. "Well," Warren said. "Well," Evelyn said. He picked up the broom from the corner of the porch and started sweeping mud off the boards. She walked back inside and started gathering bowls. The kitchen was still warm. The cornbread basket was empty. The cast iron pot sat in the sink scraped clean. Not a drop of stew left. "That was something," Warren said quietly through the screen door. "Yes, it was," Evelyn said. "But it's done now." She turned on the tap, started washing dishes. The water ran hot over her hands. She watched it swirl down the drain, carrying away the last evidence of the night. 2 hours later, Warren heard an engine. He was out by the wood pile splitting kindling. The morning was full sun, now almost warm. October in Kentucky could go either way. Some days felt like summer. Some days felt like winter was coming fast. This one felt like the world couldn't make up its mind. He paused with the axe halfway up. He listened. It was the sound of a single motorcycle coming up the gravel drive. Warren set the axe down. He walked around to the front of the house, wiping sawdust off his hands onto his jeans. He squinted down the road. It was Garrett, the bearded leader, riding alone. He pulled up in front of the porch and cut his engine. The sudden silence was almost loud. He dismounted slowly, like a man whose body was reminding him of every mile he'd ridden in the last 3 days. Warren walked over. "Forget something?" Warren asked. "No, sir," Garrett said. He stood there for a moment. He looked at the house, really looked at it, looked at the porch with its sag on the left side, looked at the roof with its 3 different colors of shingles, patches from different repairs, done over different years, looked at the windows, 2 of which were cracked, looked at the front door with its warped bottom edge, looked at the foundation stones which were settling on the south side, had been settling for years, would probably need serious work soon. He looked at all of it like a man taking inventory. "Sir," Garrett said, "you and your wife, you don't have a lot of help out here, do you?" "We get by," Warren said. "Your son gone like she told me." "Yes, family. My brother died in 2002. Her sister's in a nursing home down in Florida. So, just us." Garrett nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He looked at it for a second, then looked back at Warren. "Sir," he said, "could you do me one favor?" "Maybe. Could you and your wife step out onto the porch?" Warren looked at him, really looked at him, trying to read what was happening here. Garrett's face gave nothing away, but his eyes were steady, honest. Warren turned and called Evelyn's name through the screen door. She came out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She saw Garrett. She smiled at him, the smile you give someone you fed the night before. "Forget something?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Garrett said. He gestured down the road. Warren and Evelyn turned and looked. At first they heard it before they saw it. A low rumble, steady, deep. It rolled toward them slowly across the country building like a storm that hadn't quite arrived yet. Evelyn put her hand on Warren's arm. He covered her hand with his. The rumble grew. Then they saw the first headlights, coming around the bend in the road about a quarter mile away. Then 20 headlights, then 50, then 100, then more. Motorcycles came around that bend in a column that did not end. They came in pairs, perfectly spaced, riding slow and careful. The column kept coming. It just kept coming. Evelyn's mouth opened. She couldn't speak, couldn't form words. Warren's grip on her hand tightened. Some of the bikes were towing trailers. Pickup trucks rolled in the middle of the column, also pulling trailers. Trailers stacked with lumber, trailers stacked with shingles, trailers stacked with tools, trailers stacked with boxes and boxes of food. The column kept coming. It took 20 minutes for all of them to arrive. 20 minutes of motorcycles flowing into the field beside the farmhouse and parking in long, even rows, like a military formation, like something organized by people who knew how to move together. The riders cut their engines as they parked. The roar of arrival became the silence of 800 men standing beside their bikes. 800. Garrett turned to Warren and Evelyn. He took off his sunglasses. His eyes were wet. "Sir," he said, "ma'am, you fed 30 of ours last night." He paused. He swallowed hard. "In our world," he said, "in the world I live in, there is nothing more sacred than that. Not money, not blood, not anything." He gestured behind him at the 800 men standing in Evelyn's field. "These are my brothers," he said. "Every chapter from 4 states. We rode all night to get here. Some of them came 8 hours. "Why?" Evelyn whispered. "Because what you did last night cannot be paid back with a thank you," Garrett said. "It cannot be paid back with money. There is only one currency in our world that pays a debt like this." He looked at the house behind them, at the sagging porch, at the settling foundation, at the roof that needed replacing and the windows that needed fixing, and all the small ways a house falls apart when 2 people get old and there's nobody to help them keep it together. "Brotherhood," he said, "and brotherhood means we don't leave you in a house that's fallen down around you when we just rode out of it dry and fed." Evelyn's hand came up to her mouth. "We're going to rebuild your house," Garrett said, "top to bottom today." Warren opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. "Son," he said. His voice was rough. "You don't have to do this." "Sir," Garrett said, "with all due respect, we do." He turned to the field of men. He raised one arm. He held it up for a long second, long enough for every man in that field to see it. Then he dropped it. 800 men moved at the same time. Within 10 minutes, the front yard had become a job site. Crews formed up like they'd done this 100 times before. Men with hard hats materialized from somewhere. A foreman started calling out tasks in a voice that carried across the field. A man with a clipboard, who turned out to be a contractor and a club member, was walking the perimeter of the house with a measuring tape, making notes, shaking his head at things only he could see. Evelyn stood on the porch in shock. Her hand was still over her mouth. She couldn't seem to move it. A woman walked up to her, maybe 50 years old, gray hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, wearing a leather vest over a black t-shirt, jeans worn soft from years of use. She had kind eyes, eyes that had seen hard things and decided to stay kind anyway. She put her hand on Evelyn's arm. "I'm Sienna," she said. Her voice was warm, southern, the accent that stretched vowels and softened consonants. "I run the kitchen for the chapter. I've got 6 women with me, and we brought enough food to feed 100 men breakfast and lunch and dinner. We're going to set up in your kitchen. Is that all right with you, sweetheart?" Evelyn stared at her. She tried to form words. Nothing came out for a few seconds. "Yes," she finally managed. "Good," Sienna said. She smiled. "Now you sit down right there in that rocking chair on this porch, and you don't move. You've done your share of the cooking, ma'am." Evelyn sat down. Warren sat down next to her on the wooden bench that had been on this porch since 1974. They held hands. They couldn't do anything else. They just sat there and watched their world transform. The roof came off first. 20 men climbed up with crowbars and hammers. The old shingles came off in strips torn away and tossed down into a dumpster that had appeared in the driveway at some point. Nobody had seen it arrive. It was just there like everything else, like this was all happening according to some plan that had been written down somewhere. The mismatched tin patches went into the dumpster. The old plywood underneath, rotted in 3 places, came up next. You could see daylight through the holes. Warren had known those holes were there. He'd been meaning to fix them for 3 years. Kept putting it off because climbing on a roof at 73 seemed like a good way to break something important. New plywood went down, then tar paper, then new architectural shingles, dark green, the exact color Evelyn had once mentioned probably 10 years ago that she'd always thought would look nice. Warren remembered her saying it. He didn't think anyone else had been listening. Someone had been listening. Down on the ground, another crew was tearing out the front porch boards. The boards were rotted through in 2 places, soft spots where if you stepped wrong, your foot would go straight through. Warren had been walking around those spots for so long, he didn't even think about it anymore. You just knew where not to step. The crew lifted out the rot, replaced the joists underneath, laid down new pressure-treated boards that smelled like fresh lumber and possibility. A second crew came behind them and screwed in railings. A third crew came behind them and painted the whole thing white. Nobody was talking much. They were just working, moving together like parts of a machine that had been built for this exact purpose. A man with a tool belt full of plumbing wrenches crawled under the house. He was down there for over an hour. When he came out, his shirt was filthy and he had cobwebs in his hair, but he was smiling. He walked over to Warren and handed him a list written on a piece of cardboard. 3 pipes were about to burst, he said. Wouldn't have made it through January. All replaced now, no charge. Warren looked at the list, at the technical terms he didn't fully understand, at the work that would have cost him $2,000 if he'd hired someone, at the disaster that would have happened when those pipes burst in the middle of winter and flooded the crawl space. "Thank you," Warren said. His voice came out rough. The man nodded and walked back to his truck. The cracked windows came out. New double-pane windows went in, installed by 2 men who moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this professionally for 20 years. The warped front door came off its hinges. A new oak door, solid and heavy and true, went in its place. The mudroom got a new floor. The old linoleum, cracked and peeling, came up in sheets. New tile went down that would last another 30 years. The kitchen got a new sink, new faucet. The old ones had been leaking for months, just a slow drip that Warren kept meaning to fix but never quite got around to. The back step got rebuilt. It had been sagging for years, pulling away from the house. Now it was solid, level, safe. The chimney got swept and repointed. A man spent 3 hours up there working mortar into gaps that had been growing for a decade. The siding on the south side, which had been peeling for years, got scraped and primed and repainted in a soft cream color. Sienna brought Evelyn 3 paint chips and asked which one she liked best. Evelyn picked the cream. It went up that afternoon. In the kitchen, 6 women worked alongside whether Evelyn wanted help or not. They'd taken over completely. Industrial-sized pans appeared from somewhere. Portable burners, coolers full of eggs and bacon and sausage. They made breakfast for 800. Eggs scrambled in batches so large they had to use commercial-sized bowls. Bacon cooked on griddles set up on folding tables in the backyard. Sausage links by the hundreds. Biscuits made from scratch in Evelyn's oven batch after batch after batch. Gravy made in pots big enough to bathe a small child. They served it in shifts off folding tables set up in the yard. The men came through in groups of 20, filled their plates, ate standing up or sitting on the tailgates of trucks or on the ground. Then they went back to work and the next group came through. Evelyn watched them eat and she could not stop crying quietly to herself. She wasn't sobbing, wasn't making a scene, just tears running down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. Sienna sat down next to her and put an arm around her shoulders. Didn't say anything. Just sat there. Warren walked the property with Garrett. They didn't talk much at first, just walked, looked at the work being done. The barn was getting a new tin roof. The tool shed was getting a new door and a new lock. The fence at the road was being repaired and restained. Garrett stopped at the corner of the property where the fence met the tree line. He looked back at the house, at the work happening, at the controlled chaos of 800 men rebuilding a life. "Sir," Garrett said, "there's something I need to tell you." Warren looked at him. "My name is Garrett Blackwood," Garrett said, Jr. He paused, watched Warren's face. "My father was Daniel Blackwood. People called him Dale." Warren went very still. "He served in Vietnam," Garrett continued. "Marine, Force Recon. He came home in 1969. He rode with this club for 40 years. He died in 2008. Lung cancer, 63 years old." Warren's hand came up slowly. He pressed it against his mouth. "My father told me about a man named Warren Hartwell," Garrett said. His voice was steady but quiet. "For my whole life, he told me about a man who carried his squad through a swamp under fire. He told me about a man who saved his life on 3 separate occasions. He told me that man went home to a farm somewhere east of the mountains, and he should have looked him up, but he never did because he didn't know how to say thank you to a man who'd given him 40 more years." Warren could not speak. "I didn't know it was you," Garrett said. "I didn't know until I sat at your table last night and saw the photograph on your mantle. I sat there and I looked at that face in the Marine uniform and I knew it. That's the man my father talked about. That's the face from the box of old photos in his house." Warren wiped his face with the back of his hand. His shoulders were shaking. "Last night," Garrett said, "I didn't know we were eating in your house. We just saw a porch light. We were lost, sir. We were truly lost." "And you found my porch," Warren said. His voice barely worked. "And I found your porch," Garrett said. "Of all the porches in 3 states, we found yours." Warren looked at him for a long moment. This big man with the beard and the vest and the 800 brothers who'd ridden through the night to get here. This man who was the son of the best friend he'd ever had. The brother he'd carried through a swamp in 1968 when the bullets were flying and the world was on fire. "Son," Warren said, "your father pulled me out of that swamp twice when I couldn't walk. The shrapnel in my legs would have left me there to die. He carried me when I couldn't carry myself. We weren't squad mates. We were brothers." "I know," Garrett said. His own voice was thick now. "And now," Warren said, "now you've come here and you've done this for me." "No, sir," Garrett said firmly. "I came because of last night. Because of what you and your wife did for 30 strangers who showed up at your door in a storm. The thing about my father, that's just how I knew the porch I had to land on. That's the universe putting me in the right place. But the 800 men in this field are not here for him. They're here for the woman in your kitchen who fed 30 hungry men without asking a single question. Warren looked back at the house. The new shingles were going on. The new porch was painted. The new windows caught the afternoon light. My wife, he said, my wife is a remarkable woman. Yes, sir, she is, Garrett said. And tonight before we leave, I'd like to give her something. And I'd like to give you something too. By 5 in the afternoon, the house was finished. New roof, new porch, new windows, new door, new paint, new plumbing, new chimney, new back step. The driveway had been regraded and graveled. The barn had a new tin roof that gleamed in the late sun. The tool shed had a new lock and new hinges. The fence at the road was repaired and freshly stained dark brown. It looked like a different house. A house where people lived who had help, who had family, who weren't alone. The work crews washed up at long tables of soap and water that had been set up by the side of the barn. They put their tools back on the trailers. They moved methodically, carefully checking that everything was accounted for. Sienna's kitchen crew packed away pots and pans. They'd cooked 3 meals for 800 men. Breakfast, lunch, and now dinner was being set up on long tables in the yard. Folding tables appeared from somewhere, dozens of them set up in rows. Tablecloths went down, not paper, real cloth. Someone had brought real tablecloths. Dinner was fried chicken and mashed potatoes and green beans and rolls and sweet tea and lemonade. Church picnic food, family reunion food. The meal that said we're celebrating something. 800 men ate together. They filled their plates and sat at the tables or stood in groups or sat on the grass. They ate and talked quietly and watched the sun start to go down over the mountains. Warren and Evelyn sat at a table at the head of the arrangement. Someone had put a white tablecloth on their table. Someone had put wildflowers in a mason jar in the center. Garrett stood up. 800 men went silent. The silence that happens when people who respect each other stop talking to listen. Garrett walked over to Warren. He reached up to his vest, to the patch over his heart, the one that marked him as a member, as a brother, as someone who belonged. He unpinned it slowly. Then he pinned it onto Warren's shirt, right over his heart, right where it belonged. Sir, Garrett said, his voice carried across the yard, you are an honorary brother of this chapter. You will be welcome at any of our tables in any state for the rest of your life. 800 men stood up. Garrett turned to Evelyn. He took off his hat. He bowed his head to her. And you, ma'am, he said, you are a mother to all of us. He bowed his head. 800 men bowed their heads. The silence stretched out. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stood there, 800 men with their heads bowed to a 71-year-old woman who'd fed 30 strangers without asking why. Evelyn couldn't speak. She tried. Nothing came out. She just pressed her hand to her mouth and cried. Warren stood up. He put his hand on Garrett's shoulder. Thank you, he said. Thank you. At sundown, the bikers prepared to leave. They had a long ride still ahead of them. The memorial they had been heading to 2 days before was now the day after tomorrow in a town 300 miles south. They would be riding through the night. Some of them had jobs to get back to, lives to return to. But they'd been here. They'd done this, and that mattered. But before they went, Garrett had one more thing. He walked Warren and Evelyn to a small group of men gathered by the rebuilt porch. One of them carried a wooden box, plain pine sanded smooth, no decoration except for brass hinges. He handed it to Garrett. Garrett handed it to Warren. Warren opened it slowly. Inside was a folded American flag. The flag that had been draped over a Marine's coffin. The flag they gave to the family at a military funeral. The folds were precise, perfect the way they taught you to fold them at Arlington. Pinned to the corner was a Vietnam service medal, bronze star, purple heart. The ribbons were faded, but the medals were polished. There was a small note tucked into one of the folds. Warren unfolded it with shaking hands. It was handwritten in careful block letters. For Warren, the man who deserved these more than I did. Carry them home. Your brother Dale. Warren held the flag in his big, rough hands. He did not say anything. Could not say anything. His throat had closed up completely. My father left these to me when he died, Garrett said quietly. He left a letter too. It said they should have been buried with the man who earned them, the man who carried him when he couldn't walk, the man who gave him 40 more years to live. Warren's shoulders shook once, just once. Then he was steady again. Evelyn stepped close. She put her arms around her husband. He leaned into her and held the flag between them like it was the most precious thing in the world. He always talked about you, Garrett said. Always. I grew up hearing about Warren Hartwell, about the bravest man he'd ever met, about the brother he'd left behind and never found again. Warren nodded. He couldn't speak, just nodded. I think, Garrett said, I think he left these to me so I could give them to you. I think he knew somehow that I'd find you. Warren finally found his voice. Thank you, son, he said. Thank you. 800 engines started up at the same time. The sound was unreal. The earth trembled under the porch. The new windows rattled slightly in their frames. The chickens in the barn went quiet. Even the trees seemed to hold still. And then 2 by 2, 800 Hells Angels rolled down the gravel drive of Warren and Evelyn Hartwell. They rode slow, respectful, no roaring engines, no showing off, just a long column of brothers heading back out into the world, leaving behind a house that was whole again and 2 people who would never be quite alone again. They turned out onto the country road. They headed south in a column that stretched for almost 2 miles. You could see their tail lights snaking through the mountains, a red river of light moving through the darkness. Warren and Evelyn stood on their new porch and watched until the last tail light disappeared around the bend. Then it was quiet, real quiet, country quiet. Crickets starting up in the grass, a dog barking somewhere far off, a breeze moving through the maple trees. The sound of the world settling into evening. Evelyn looked at Warren. Warren looked at Evelyn. Neither one of them could quite believe what had just happened. They walked into the kitchen of their rebuilt house. The cast iron pot was clean and back on the bottom shelf where it belonged. The new sink shone under the overhead light. The new floor was solid under their feet, no soft spots, no cracks. A note sat on the kitchen counter written in Sienna's careful hand. Mrs. Hartwell, there's a freezer's worth of food in your basement. There's enough firewood for 3 winters in your barn. There's a phone number on this note. You call it day or night for any reason at all. We're family. Sienna. Evelyn read the note twice. She set it down carefully. She put her hand over her face. Warren put his arm around her. They stood there at their kitchen, in their house that had been falling down yesterday and was whole today, and they held each other. The story spread. It spread the way stories like that always do. Slowly at first. A few mentions in biker forums. Someone posted a photograph on the chapter's social media page. The house before and after, the column of bikes stretching down the road. Then a local news story picked it up. Then a regional one. Then a national magazine writer drove out from Charlotte to interview Warren and Evelyn. They politely declined to be on television. They didn't want fame. They didn't want strangers showing up at their house with cameras. They didn't want to be a story. They told the writer the same thing Evelyn had said to Garrett at 4:30 in the morning at her kitchen table. Somebody's mother is sitting up worrying about every one of those boys, she said. I just did what their mothers would have wanted somebody to do. The writer printed that quote, and that was the end of it. But the bikers passed through. Word travels in that world. Word travels fast, and it travels far, and it doesn't fade. Once a story gets into the bones of a brotherhood like that, it stays there. A pair of riders would pull up the gravel drive once a month or so, sometimes alone, sometimes in a group of 3 or 4. They would stop at the end of the drive. They would take their helmets off. They would walk up to the porch. Mr. Hartwell, they'd say, Ma'am, I just wanted to see the porch I'd heard about. And Warren would invite them in for coffee. And Evelyn would feed them every time. She couldn't help it. It was who she was. You came to her door, she fed you. That was the deal. That was how she moved through the world. Sometimes they'd stay an hour. Sometimes they'd stay 3. They'd sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee and eat whatever Evelyn put in front of them. And they'd talk quietly about the road and the weather and nothing in particular. And then they'd thank her and they'd leave and they'd ride away. But they always came back. Once a year on the anniversary of that October night, Garrett brought the chapter back. Not 800 this time, just 20 or 30, a manageable number. The core group, the ones who'd been there that first night or the ones who'd helped rebuild the house. They would ride up on a Saturday morning. They would eat at Evelyn's table. She would make stew and cornbread, the same meal she'd made that first night, because it felt right. It felt like honoring something. They would help with anything that needed fixing. A shingle that had come loose, a section of fence that needed a new post, the gutters that needed cleaning. Small things, maintenance things, things that pile up when you're in your 70s and you can't do everything yourself anymore. They would stay for dinner. They would leave the next morning. It was a tradition now. Every October, like clockwork, 20 or 30 bikes would come up that gravel drive, and Warren and Evelyn would be waiting on the porch. The years passed the way years do, slow and fast at the same time. Warren turned 74, then 75, then 76. His back got worse. His knees got worse. He started using a cane when he walked to the mailbox, though he refused to use it in the house. Evelyn turned 72, then 73, then 74. Her hands started to shake a little when she poured coffee. She got tired more easily, but she still cooked, still gardened, still kept that house running like she'd done for 51 years. They were getting old. They both knew it. They didn't talk about it much. What was there to say? You got old or you died young. Those were the options. They'd chosen old, they'd take it. The bikers kept coming, not just Garrett's chapter. Word had spread beyond them. Bikers from other states would show up. Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, even a few from as far as Texas and California. They'd heard the story. They wanted to see the porch, wanted to meet the woman who'd fed 30 strangers, wanted to shake the hand of the man who carried their brother's father through a swamp in Vietnam. Warren and Evelyn met them all, fed them all, welcomed them all. Their house became something, a landmark, a pilgrimage site. Not officially, nobody put up a sign, nobody wrote it down anywhere. But in the world of men who rode motorcycles and lived by codes of brotherhood and loyalty, the Hartwell house meant something. It meant there was still kindness in the world. It meant there were still people who would open their door to strangers. It meant there was still a place where you could show up wet and cold and lost, and someone would feed you without asking why. Spring came in 2019. The dogwoods bloomed early that year, white flowers covering the trees like snow. Evelyn loved the dogwoods. She planted 3 of them when they'd first bought this property back in 1967. They were massive now, old and gnarled and beautiful. She spent a lot of time that spring sitting on the porch in the rocking chair looking at those dogwood trees. Warren would sit next to her on the bench. They'd drink coffee and watch the morning come up over the mountains and not say much. They'd been married 54 years. They didn't need to say much. One morning in April, Warren woke up and Evelyn was still asleep. That wasn't unusual. She'd been sleeping later lately, tired more easily. He'd let her rest. He got up quietly, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table and did his crossword puzzle. By 9 o'clock, she still hadn't come down. By 10, he started to worry. He walked upstairs, opened the bedroom door. She was lying in bed on her side facing the window. The morning light was coming through the curtains. She looked peaceful. Warren sat down on the edge of the bed. He took her hand. It was cool. He sat there for a long time, just holding her hand, looking at her face. She looked younger somehow. The lines had smoothed out. She looked like the girl he'd married in 1965, young and beautiful and full of fire. He thought about the first time he'd seen her, 1963. She'd been standing in line at the grocery store arguing with the cashier about the price of tomatoes. She'd won that argument. She'd won most arguments for the next 56 years. He thought about the night 30 men had ridden up that drive, the night everything changed, the night he'd learned that the world could still surprise you even at 73. He thought about Clayton, their boy, 26 years old, gone too soon, the ache that never quite went away. He thought about Dale, about carrying him through that swamp, about the way some debts take 40 years to find their way home. He sat there and held her hand, and he didn't call anyone. Not yet. After a while, maybe an hour, maybe more, he stood up. He kissed her forehead. He pulled the blanket up a little higher. Then he went downstairs. He picked up the phone. He called Garrett before he called anyone else. Garrett answered on the second ring. "This is Warren Hartwell," Warren said. His voice was steady. "I need you to come." "I'm on my way," Garrett said. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. 200 Hell's Angels stood at Evelyn's funeral. The service was at the Methodist church in town where she'd gone every Sunday for 40 years. The church only held about 150 people, so most of the bikers stood outside. They stood in two long lines from the chapel doors to the hearse. Perfect formation, silent, still. They wore their vests, their patches, their colors, because that's who they were, and Evelyn had never asked them to be anything different. When the service ended, they carried her out. Warren walked behind the casket. He carried the wooden box with the folded flag inside, the flag that had belonged to Dale, the flag that Garrett had given him 3 years ago. He walked between those two lines of men, 200 men who'd ridden from 4 states to be here, to honor a woman who'd fed 30 strangers one night in a storm. They saluted her as she passed, every single one of them, hands to their foreheads, held there until the hearse drove away. Warren had asked them to come. He'd called Garrett and said, "She would have wanted you there." And they came, all of them. Warren lived another 4 years after Evelyn. 4 years in a house that felt too big and too quiet and too full of memories all at the same time. 4 years of waking up and forgetting for just a second that she was gone, then remembering all over again. He kept the house the way she'd left it. Her coffee mug still sat on the counter. Her reading glasses still sat on the table by her chair. Her garden tools still hung in the shed waiting for hands that would never pick them up again. The bikers still came, maybe more than before, like they knew he needed the company, like they understood that a man could die of loneliness just as surely as he could die of anything else. Garrett came every month, sometimes alone, sometimes with 2 or 3 others. He'd pull up the gravel drive and Warren would already be on the porch waiting. They'd sit and drink coffee and talk about small things. The weather, the road, how the bikes were running. They never talked about Evelyn directly, but she was there in every conversation. In the cornbread Warren still made from her recipe, in the way he kept the house clean because she would have wanted it that way, in the photographs on the mantle that he dusted every Sunday. Other bikers came too, younger ones who'd heard the story but had never met her. They wanted to see the porch, wanted to meet the man who'd carried Dale Blackwood through a Vietnamese swamp, wanted to understand what had happened here that had become legend. Warren met them all. He'd make coffee. He'd tell the story if they asked, though he kept it simple. "My wife fed 30 men in a storm. They came back and fixed our house, that's all." But it wasn't all. They knew it wasn't all. You could feel it in the house, in the bones of the place. Something sacred had happened here. Something about what people could be for each other when they chose to be. Warren turned 77 in 2020. The world shut down that year. Pandemic, lockdowns, people afraid to leave their houses, afraid to touch each other, afraid of the air itself. The bikers still came. Not as many, not all at once, but they came. They wore masks if Warren asked them to. They kept their distance if that's what he needed. But they came. Because brotherhood doesn't stop for a virus. Brotherhood doesn't stop for fear. Garrett came in April of that year, right after the anniversary of Evelyn's death. He brought a bouquet of dogwood flowers cut from his own yard 3 hours away. "She loved these," Warren said. His voice was getting rougher, harder to push words out. "I know," Garrett said. "You told me once." They put the flowers in a vase on her grave. The cemetery was small, local, up on a hill overlooking the valley. You could see the mountains from there. You could see the whole world spread out like God had meant for it to be seen. Warren stood there looking at her headstone. Evelyn Marie Hartwell, 1945 to 2019. Beloved wife, mother, teacher, friend. "I miss her," Warren said, simple as that. "I know," Garrett said. They stood there for a while. Then they went back to the house and drank coffee on the porch. Warren turned 78 in 2021. He was slowing down. Couldn't split wood anymore. Couldn't climb a ladder. Couldn't do half the things he used to do without thinking about it. But he could still make coffee, could still sit on the porch, could still tell stories when people asked. Every October, Garrett still brought the chapter back. 20, sometimes 30 riders. They'd pull up on a Saturday morning and Warren would be waiting. They'd eat together. Warren would make Evelyn stew. He'd learned how after she died. Had to. It was tradition now. October 15th, the anniversary of that first night he made her stew. He wasn't as good at it as she'd been. Nobody was. But he tried. He measured nothing just like she used to do, added things until it felt right, let it simmer until it smelled like memory. The bikers would eat and tell him it was perfect. He knew they were being kind, but he appreciated it anyway. They'd spend the afternoon fixing things. There were always things. A loose board, a clogged gutter, the fence that never stopped needing repair. They'd work quietly, efficiently, and by evening everything would be tight and right again. Then they'd leave, and Warren would stand on the porch and wave until the last taillight disappeared around the bend, just like he'd done with Evelyn that first morning, standing on the porch, watching them go, feeling like the world had shifted somehow and would never quite shift back. In the summer of 2022, Warren started having chest pains. Nothing major, just pressure, tightness, the thing that probably meant his heart was getting tired of working. He didn't tell anyone. What was the point? He was 79 years old. Hearts got tired. That was how it worked. He kept living, kept sitting on the porch, kept making coffee, kept waiting for the sound of motorcycles coming up the drive. That October, Garrett came with the usual group, maybe 25 bikes this time. They pulled up, and Warren was on the porch in his usual spot, but something was different. He looked smaller, thinner, like he was starting to disappear. Garrett noticed immediately. He walked up onto the porch and looked at Warren with eyes that had seen enough death to recognize it when it was coming. "You okay, old man?" Garrett asked. "I'm 79, Warren said. "I'm not supposed to be okay." "You seeing a doctor? What for, so he can tell me I'm dying? I already know that. Been dying since the day I was born. Just taking my time about it." Garrett sat down. He didn't push it. Warren was a grown man, a Marine, a man who had seen combat and survived and earned the right to make his own choices. They sat in silence for a while. "She's waiting for me," Warren said quietly. "I can feel it, like she's standing just on the other side of something, and all I have to do is step through." "You're not afraid of dying?" Warren shook his head. "No, I'm afraid of leaving this porch, this house, afraid nobody will remember what happened here." Garrett leaned forward, put his elbows on his knees, looked out at the yard where 800 men had stood 6 years ago. "Brother," he said, "nobody's going to forget. This story is in our bones now. I tell it to every prospect who wants to join the club, every young rider who thinks brotherhood is just about bikes and leather. I tell them about you and Evelyn, about 30 strangers in a storm, about a woman who fed people without asking why, about a man who opened his door when he didn't have to." Warren's eyes were wet. "That's good," he said. "That's real good." They sat there until the sun went down. Then Garrett helped Warren inside, and they ate stew together at the kitchen table. Just the two of them, like family, like brothers. Warren turned 80 in January of 2023. Garrett threw him a party, nothing big, just a core group, 15, maybe 20 people. They brought a cake, sang happy birthday. Warren blew out the candles with lungs that barely worked anymore. He made a wish, the same wish he'd been making for 4 years. "Let me see her again." Spring came. The dogwoods bloomed. Warren spent most of his time on the porch now, just sitting, watching, waiting. He could feel it coming. Death. Like a season. Like something that had been scheduled all along and was finally arriving on time. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. On a Tuesday morning in late April, Warren woke early. He made coffee the way Evelyn had taught him. Strong, no sugar. He sat on the porch and watched the sun come up. He picked up his crossword puzzle, found his pencil, started on 7 down. The sun climbed higher. The coffee got cold. Warren's hand went still on the pencil. He looked peaceful, like he just decided to rest for a minute before finishing the puzzle. A neighbor came by at noon to check on him. She did that sometimes, brought him groceries, made sure he was eating. She was a good person, the neighbor Evelyn would have been. She found him in the rocking chair on the porch. He was sitting with his legs stretched out, a coffee cup on the small table beside him. A book of crossword puzzles lay open in his lap. He had a pencil in his hand. The patch was still pinned to his work shirt. the one Garrett had given him. He'd worn it almost every day for 7 years, wore it like armor, like proof that he belonged to something bigger than himself. The neighbor called 911, then she called Garrett. Garrett was there in 3 hours, rode straight through, no stops, just him and his bike and the road. By the time he arrived, the coroner had already taken Warren's body. The porch was empty, the rocking chair sat still, the coffee cup was still there, half full, cold. Garrett sat down on the bench where Warren used to sit. He looked out at the yard, at the barn with its tin roof, at the fence they'd restained, at the dogwood trees blooming white against the blue sky. He cried, first time he'd cried in 20 years. But he cried. For Warren, for Evelyn, for Dale, his father who'd found a brother in a swamp and lost him for 40 years. For the porch light that had burned in a storm. For everything that had happened here that proved the world could still be good if people chose to make it that way. 300 Hells Angels stood at Warren's funeral. More than had come for Evelyn. Word had spread farther this time. Chapters from 8 states sent representatives. Some had ridden 12 hours, some had ridden 20. They came because Warren was one of them. Honorary brother. The patch he wore wasn't ceremonial. It was real. He'd earned it, not by riding, not by following club rules, but by living in a way that embodied everything they believed about brotherhood and loyalty and taking care of your own. The service was at the same Methodist church, same preacher, same hymns. The church was packed, standing room only. The bikers filled the overflow into the parking lot. When it was time, they carried him out. Garrett was one of the pallbearers. He felt the weight of that casket on his shoulder, and he thought about his father, about the weight of a man who couldn't walk being carried through a swamp, about debt and honor and the way some things get passed down through generations. They buried Warren next to Evelyn on the hill overlooking the valley. They buried him with his patch still pinned to his shirt. Garrett had made sure of that, had told the funeral director, "Don't you touch that patch." He earned it. He goes in the ground wearing it. The casket went down. The preacher said words. People cried. Then 300 bikers saluted, held the salute until the casket was covered with earth. After they gathered at the house, someone had brought food. Someone always brought food. They filled the kitchen, the living room, and the porch. They ate and talked quietly and told stories about Warren. About the time he'd helped a young rider fix his bike at 2 in the morning. About the time he'd sat on this porch and talked to a prospect out of quitting the club when things got hard. About the way he made coffee. About the way he never complained. About the way he'd loved his wife so completely that when she died, part of him had died too, and he'd just been waiting to follow. Garrett stood on the porch as the sun went down. The same porch where this had all started, where Evelyn had stood and said, "Get inside before you catch pneumonia," where Warren had said, "Boots off in the mudroom." The same porch where 800 men had stood and bowed their heads to a woman who'd fed strangers. It meant something. All of it. Every piece. Sienna came up beside him. She was older now, 57, gray hair completely white, but still strong, still here. "What happens to the house?" she asked. "It goes to Warren's estate," Garrett said. "No kids, no family. It'll be sold." "That's a shame." "Maybe, or maybe whoever buys it will be exactly who's supposed to have it." They stood there in silence. "You think they knew?" Sienna asked. "That night when they let us in, you think they knew what it would become?" Garrett thought about that. About Evelyn standing at the door looking at 30 soaked, dangerous men. About Warren waving them in like it was the most natural thing in the world. "No," he said. "I don't think they knew. I think they just did what they thought was right, and everything else followed from that." The house sold in June of 2023. A young couple bought it. Working-class family from Tennessee. Husband and wife, both 30 years old. 2 kids, 6 and 8. The husband, Kyle Mitchell, had gotten a job at a factory in town. They needed space, needed a place to raise their kids that wasn't the city. They fell in love with the house the moment they saw it. The new roof, the solid porch, the way it sat on the land like it had been there forever and would be there long after everyone was gone. They didn't know the story. The realtor hadn't mentioned it. It was just a house, a good house at a fair price. They moved in on a Saturday in July. brought their furniture, unpacked boxes. The kids ran through the rooms, claiming bedrooms. Kyle's wife, Emma, started planning where to put the couch, where to hang pictures. Kyle walked out onto the porch to take a break. He stood there looking at the yard, at the barn, at the mountains in the distance. That's when he saw it. A small brass plaque set into the porch railing, right by the front door. He'd walked past it 3 times and hadn't noticed it. He bent down to look closer. The plaque was simple, tasteful. It said, "For the people who fed 30 strangers, GB." Kyle stared at it. He called Emma over. "What do you think this means?" he asked. She looked at it, shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe someone who used to live here." That night after the kids were in bed, Kyle Googled it. He tried different combinations. Fed 30 strangers, Kentucky. GB plaque porch. Appalachian house bikers. He found it on the 3rd try. A forum post from 2017, someone had written about a couple in their 70s who'd let 30 Hells Angels into their home during a storm. About 800 bikers who'd showed up the next morning to rebuild their house. About a woman who'd fed people without asking questions. About a man who'd been a Marine in Vietnam. There were photos, the house before and after, the column of motorcycles stretching down the road. Warren and Evelyn sitting at a table surrounded by bikers. Kyle read the whole thing. Then he read it again. Then he showed Emma. She cried, just sat there with her hand over her mouth and cried. "We bought that house," she whispered. "We're living in that house." "I know. What do we do?" Kyle thought about that, about the weight of living in a place where something sacred had happened, about whether they were worthy of it. "We take care of it," he said finally. "We keep it the way they would have wanted. And if anyone ever comes asking about it, we tell them the story." Once a month, a motorcycle would roll up the gravel drive, sometimes alone, sometimes 2 or 3. They'd pull up slowly, cut their engines, stand there for a moment looking at the house. Kyle learned to recognize the sound, that particular rumble of a Harley coming up the drive. He'd walk out onto the porch and wave. "Can I help you?" he'd ask. And they'd take off their helmets and say something like, "I just wanted to see it. The house, the porch, I heard the story." And Kyle was here, and Kyle would invite them in. He'd make coffee. Emma would come out and say hello. The kids would peek around corners, shy and curious. And the bikers would sit at the kitchen table and tell them what had happened here. Each one told it a little differently. But the core was always the same. Evelyn and Warren, 30 strangers, a storm, kindness without questions, 800 brothers, a house rebuilt, a debt paid, a story that lived. Kyle started keeping a journal. Every time a biker came, he'd write down their name and where they were from and what they remembered. He had 40 entries by the end of the first year, 60 by the end of the second. The bikers were getting older. The ones who'd been here that first night were in their 50s now, some in their 60s. Time was passing. The story was becoming history. But it wasn't fading. In October of 2024, Garrett called. Kyle had given him his number the first time Garrett had come by 6 months after they'd moved in. Garrett had ridden up alone, parked his bike, stood on the porch looking at the house like it might disappear if he blinked. Kyle had invited him in, had listened as Garrett told the story from the beginning, about being lost in the storm, about Evelyn opening the door, about Warren popping his shoulder back into place, about the stew and the cornbread and the coffee at 4:30 in the morning, about his father, about Vietnam, about a debt that had taken 40 years to find its way home. Garrett had cried when he told that part, this big man with gray in his beard and scars on his hands. He'd sat at that kitchen table and cried. Now he was calling. "Kyle," Garrett said, "I wanted to ask you something." "Sure." "Every year on October 15th, we used to come back, 20, 30 of us. We'd spend the day there, eat a meal, fix anything that needed fixing. It was tradition." "I know," Kyle said. "I read about it. Would you mind if we kept doing that? If we came to your house, I know it's yours now. I know you don't owe us anything, but it would mean something to us to keep the tradition going." Kyle didn't even hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Please, we'd be honored." So they came. October 15th, 2024, 23 bikes rolled up the gravel drive. Older men now, grayer, slower, but still riding, still brothers. They brought food, they brought tools, they brought stories. Kyle and Emma fed them, not stew and cornbread. They didn't try to recreate that. That was Evelyn's meal. Instead, they made pulled pork sandwiches and coleslaw and cornbread. Southern food, comfort food. Their way of saying welcome. The bikers ate everything, told Emma it was the best meal they'd had in years. Probably would have said that no matter what she served, but she could tell they meant it. After lunch, they worked, fixed a section of fence that had come loose, cleaned the gutters, replaced two boards on the porch that were starting to rot. Small things, maintenance, care. By evening, everything was tight and right again. They sat on the porch as the sun went down. Kyle brought out beer. The kids sat on the steps listening as the bikers told stories about Warren and Evelyn, about the woman who'd looked at 30 dangerous strangers and seen somebody's sons, about the man who carried his best friend through a swamp and never asked for thanks, about a porch light burning in a storm, about 800 men who'd understood that some debts can only be paid forward. The youngest biker there, a man named Tommy, who was 43, now told a story about being 19 and stupid and questioning why they were rebuilding some random old couple's house, about Garrett tearing into him in front of everyone, about learning what honor actually meant. "I painted a wall in the living room," Tommy said. "Mrs. Hartwell made me sweet tea and told me I was doing a good job. Nobody had told me I was doing a good job at anything in about 5 years. I think about that sometimes. When things get hard, I think about her smile and that sweet tea and the way she made me feel like I mattered." Emma was crying. Kyle had his arm around her. The bikers left at sunset, same as always. Engine starting up, taillights moving down the drive. That long farewell. Kyle and Emma stood on the porch and waved until the last bike disappeared. Then Emma turned to her husband. "We have to keep this going," she said, "for as long as we live here. We have to keep the tradition." "I know," Kyle said. "And when we're gone, whoever comes next has to know, has to understand what this place means." "They will," Kyle said. "We'll make sure of it." The years passed. The bikers kept coming. Kyle kept the journal, kept recording names and stories, kept making sure the house was maintained the way Warren and Evelyn would have wanted. Emma planted a garden, not the same plants Evelyn had grown, different ones, green beans and squash and tomatoes, but a garden nonetheless, because the house needed a garden, because that's what Evelyn would have done. The kids got older, started asking questions about the plaque, about the bikers, about why strangers kept showing up at their house. Kyle told them the story over and over until they knew it by heart. His daughter Sarah, 8 years old, asked him once, "Are we part of the story now?" Kyle thought about that. "Yes," he said. "I think we are, not the same way, but we're the next chapter. We're the people who keep it alive." One night in the fall of 2025, there was a storm. Not as bad as the one in 2016, but bad enough. Thunder and lightning and rain coming down hard. The night where you stayed inside and waited for morning. Around 9 o'clock, Kyle heard a motorcycle, single engine, coming up the drive slowly. He looked out the window. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, was getting off a bike that had clearly seen better days. She was soaked through, shivering. She limped slightly as she walked toward the porch. Kyle opened the door before she could knock. She stood there dripping, looking at him with eyes that were trying hard not to show fear. "I'm sorry," she said. "My bike died about a mile back. I saw your porch light. I just need to use a phone. Call someone to pick me up." Kyle looked at her, looked at the rain, looked at the way she was shaking. He thought about Evelyn, about Warren, about 30 strangers in a storm. He stepped back and held the door open wider. "Get inside before you catch pneumonia," he said. The woman blinked, stared at him. "What?" "Come inside," Kyle said. "We'll get you dry, get you warm, get you fed, then we'll figure out the bike." She hesitated for just a second. Then she stepped inside. Emma came out of the kitchen, saw the wet girls standing in their living room, understood immediately. "Bathroom's upstairs," Emma said. "First door on the right. There are towels in the closet. Take all you need. I'll make coffee." The girl looked between them like she couldn't quite believe what was happening. "I don't understand," she said. "You don't have to," Kyle said. "You're cold. We're going to help. That's all." He went to call a tow truck. Emma went to make coffee and heat up leftovers. The girl went upstairs to dry off. And on the mantel, in a frame that Kyle had put there the week they moved in, Warren and Evelyn looked out at their living room and smiled. An hour later, the girl was sitting at the kitchen table eating pulled pork and drinking coffee. The tow truck was on its way. She was warm and dry and safe. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me." Kyle smiled. He'd been waiting for this question, had been waiting since the moment he opened the door. "Let me tell you a story," he said, "about this house, about the people who used to live here, about what happened one night in a storm a lot like this one." And he told her the whole thing, start to finish. Evelyn and Warren, 30 bikers, 800 brothers, a house rebuilt, a tradition born, a story that wouldn't die. The girl listened with her mouth open. When he finished, she was crying. "That's real," she whispered. "That's real," Kyle said. "And you're keeping it going. You're doing what they did." "Trying to," Kyle said, "best we can." The girl wiped her eyes. "My name's Rachel. I'm riding from Florida to Michigan. My mom's sick. I'm going to see her. I've been on the road 3 days and I'm scared and tired and I didn't know if I was going to make it." Emma reached across the table and took her hand. "You're going to make it," she said. "We're going to make sure your bike gets fixed. We're going to make sure you have a place to sleep tonight. And tomorrow we're going to make sure you have food for the road. And you're going to make it to your mother." Rachel cried harder. "Why are you so kind?" she asked. Emma looked at Kyle. Kyle looked at the photograph on the mantel. "Because somebody's mother is sitting up tonight worrying about you," Emma said quietly, "and this is what we would want someone to do." The exact words Evelyn had said to Garrett 9 years ago, in this kitchen, at this table. Some stories don't end. They just find new people to carry them forward. Rachel stayed the night, slept in the guest room, left the next morning after Emma packed her a cooler full of food. Her bike was fixed, running good. She hugged them both before she left. "I'll never forget this," she said. "Never." "Remember it," Kyle said. "And someday when someone needs help, you do the same. That's how it works." Rachel nodded. Then she rode away. Kyle and Emma stood on the porch and watched her go, just like Warren and Evelyn had done, just like they would do again, and again, and again. Because this was the house, the porch, the place where strangers became family and kindness became legend, and one small act of humanity became a story that would outlive everyone who'd been part of it. The porch light burned yellow and steady, the same light that had burned in 2016, the same light that had called 30 lost men out of a storm. It would keep burning. Kyle made sure of that. Every night that light went on, and it stayed on until morning, because you never knew. You never knew when someone might need it, when someone might be lost and cold and scared and looking for any sign that the world wasn't entirely cruel. The light was that sign. The porch was that place. The house was that promise. That if you came to this door, you would be welcome. You would be fed. You would be cared for. No questions asked. No judgment rendered. Just kindness. Simple, uncomplicated kindness. The kind that changes lives. The kind that builds legacies. The kind that proves over and over again that people can be good. That they can choose to be good. That goodness is not weakness, but strength. That opening your door to a stranger is not naive, but brave. That feeding someone who's hungry is not charity, but humanity at its most basic and most beautiful. Garrett rode by one last time in the spring of 2026. He was 65 years old. His beard was completely gray. His hands hurt from arthritis. His back hurt from 50 years of riding. But he was still riding. Would ride until he couldn't anymore. He pulled up the drive slowly. Kyle was on the porch waiting. He always seemed to know when Garrett was coming. They sat together in silence for a long time. Just two men on a porch watching the world turn. "You're doing good work here," Garrett said finally. "Keeping it alive." "Trying," Kyle said. "Evelyn would have liked you. Warren too. They would have been happy knowing the house went to people who understood." "I hope so." Garrett stood up slowly. His knees creaked. Everything creaked these days. I don't know how many more times I'll make it out here, he said. Getting old, getting tired. Kyle stood too, put out his hand. Garrett shook it, then pulled him into a hug. Thank you, Garrett said, for keeping the light on. Always, Kyle said. Garrett rode away. Kyle watched until he disappeared. Then he walked back and saw where Emma was making dinner, and the kids were doing homework, and life was happening the way life happens in houses where people love each other. He walked to the mantel, looked at the photograph of Warren and Evelyn. They were young in that picture, probably in their 40s, standing in front of the same house. Warren had his arm around Evelyn. They were both smiling. They looked happy. They looked like people who knew how to be kind, who knew that the measure of a life wasn't in what you accumulated, but in what you gave away. Kyle touched the frame gently. We'll keep it going, he said quietly. I promise. We'll keep the light on. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains. The dogwoods were blooming. The world was turning. And on a porch in Kentucky, a yellow light flickered on, casting its warm glow into the gathering dark. A beacon, a promise, a story that would never end as long as there were people willing to open their doors, willing to feed strangers, willing to believe that kindness wasn't foolish but fundamental, that brotherhood wasn't about blood but about choice, that family wasn't who you were born to but who you showed up for. The light burned steady, and somewhere out on the road, someone lost and cold and scared saw it shining in the distance. Saw it and knew without knowing how they knew that if they could just make it to that light, they would be okay. They would be safe. They would be home. And they were right. They always were.